I'm Sarah Clover. This is the Agent of Change podcast, discussing all things about Agent of Change. And this is chapter 1, introductory to the whole concept of Agent of Change, whether it's something that you feel you know about, have heard about, know nothing about, or would like to know a little bit more about. We are just going to explore the whole idea and concept of Agent of Change in this chapter and just see where that takes us. So who is the agent? What is the change? And what is this principle that we are trying to address? Well, the term doesn't just mean one thing. It is sometimes used as if it were just one concrete concept, the agent of change or the agent of change principle. And that's not really true. It's more of a term trying to capture an idea or a set of principles to try and address a particular situation. It's a rapidly developing area of policy, if not law, and that is likely to be accelerated by the forthcoming wholesale planning reform that we have on the table, and we may or may not see something reflected in the planning bill, or if not that, then possibly the future iterations of the NPPF, National Planning Policy Framework. So there is nothing about the agent of change at this point in time that is law. There is no legal definition of it. It is not in any statute or set of regulations. It is a policy concept only, and that is a point about it that is sometimes missed, and it can be discussed as if it had more impact than just a policy, but that is in fact what it is. So what is it? Well, it's a term that is used to try to describe the approach to take to the relationship between new development, built development typically, or a change of use perhaps of land, and most commonly residential. So incoming residential development, and that would be the agent. It doesn't have to be residential, it could be something else entirely, but this tends to be the scenario in which we see this term used the most. So it's the agent of change, the incoming development, built or change of use that is going to impact on something that's already there, a business, other development, and usually, again, typically we're talking about a noise source, and the arena in which we see it used a lot is for nighttime economy venues, music venues, clubs, pubs, grassroots music venues typically, and some of the types of places that we would really want to support and protect. And the principle tries to capture the situation in which the incoming agent has to bear the burden or the responsibility of taking the steps that are necessary to protect what is already there, or at least not to place unreasonable restrictions and demands upon them, upon the users that were there first. And that's an important element of this whole idea. And now usually the pre-existing land uses or businesses will be creating impact, and very commonly noise, but it doesn't have to be noise. It could be odour, it could be light, it could be all sorts of different things. And very often those businesses, those premises won't have been bothering anybody previously. That's probably why they were located there in the first place, that they had at one point or another in time chosen a location that didn't have neighbours but were likely to complain about them, and that is how they come to be situated where they are. And it's not uncommon either to find those businesses located in buildings that are not fit really for containing the impact to which the businesses are giving rise. So they're typically not well sound insulated. They might be old warehouses, they might be old business premises that were never built with the intention of insulating them from emitting the kind of noise that would upset local neighbours, local residents. So that's a common phenomenon as well. The incoming development, the agent of change, is very likely to be of the sort that is delivering neighbours to the doorstep that are going to be sensitive to the impacts of the existing land users, the existing buildings and businesses, the music venues, nightclubs, whatever they might happen to be. And we could be talking industrial premises as well, of course, and there are plenty of examples of those in the case law. Businesses that are undertaking some kind of industrial process that also creates a lot of noise, a lot of smell perhaps, or emissions of other descriptions. So those are the sorts of issues that we're addressing when we talk about agent of change, and the incoming neighbours who are likely to be sensitive to those impacts typically won't be unaware that this is the locality that they're moving to. And if you think, for example, of people moving into town and city centres and coming into a vibrant nighttime economy area, and for a lot of people that's an attraction. When they first buy their property, they think they're coming to an area that is exciting and cool, somewhere where they can see themselves living, and perhaps that suits them very well initially. But circumstances change, and the idea that people will not complain because they knew they were moving to this impactful area is not always borne out in reality, it's safe to say. And people change their life situation, perhaps they change their job, they change their work pattern, there might be a baby in the family, all sorts of things, life stresses that take over, and suddenly they realise that they are more affected by the impacts around them than they thought they were going to be. And typically people would rather try and make the irritation stop than change their home environment and try to move. And that's what happens. And that is the problem, that's the nub of the problem to which the agent of change principle is addressing itself. Now, why would we want to bring those sorts of neighbours, potentially sensitive neighbours, closer to the things that are going to upset them? Why would we even do that? Well, that's the subject in more detail of another chapter in this podcast, where we're looking in a little bit more detail as to how our modern urbanisation, densification, regeneration gives rise to this problem and brings more neighbours, more residents into these impactful areas, into nighttime economy areas and similar. But in a nutshell, we're doing it because land is a valuable and diminishing resource. We don't have endless quantities of it. We want to preserve our green spaces. We want to preserve our open, tranquil spaces. We don't like building on green field, typically, if it can be avoided. It's a good thing to reuse brownfield. It's a good thing to regenerate town centres, city centres, places that need updating for modern living in all sorts of respects. It's good for a lot of our modern living aspirations. It's good for cutting down on transport and carbon emissions and air pollution, and it's good for bringing people closer to their hubs of work and education and entertainment, of course, so that people are living cheek by jowl with the types of resources that they want to use. And that's a step away from our traditional model, whereby we put people further away from the busy centres, industrial centres, noise centres, so that they can live a quiet life in peaceful suburban locations and then come to their places of work, the factories or the industry or whatever else it might be, do their work and then leave and go home again. That is starting to become quite an outmoded model for living, and we will look at that in more detail in another chapter as to how that comes to be. But the purpose of this chapter is to take it as read that that is so, and it gives rise to this conflict between land users, the incoming and the existing, and that is what the principle is all about trying to address. And of course, one of the issues is that our regulatory systems have not caught up with this phenomenon as yet. So our three primary regulatory regimes, that's the planning regime, the licensing regime and the environmental protection regime, still work upon the premise that the noise source and the noise receptor, the sensitive receptor, the resident, the neighbour, are going to be kept apart from each other. They're going to be at distance from each other. And many of our legal principles, many of our policies, a lot of case law is predicated upon that assumption that they will be kept separate and apart. And of course that does not match anymore with the way in which we are living our modern lives. They're not being kept apart, they're being brought ever closer together. Now, you would think that the law would have precious little sympathy for people who move to a nuisance and then complain about it. And this is the classic church bell syndrome, sometimes scornfully referred to when people move to country locations, village locations, and move next to the church and then complain about the church bells. We use that as a rather sniffy example of how people should behave and how they actually do behave in real life. And of course people are berated for moving to the countryside and complaining about the sounds of the country, cocks crowing, and the smells of the country, and so on and so forth. Well, the law does not have as much sympathy for the existing noise source as you might imagine, and that again will be the subject of another chapter in this series, looking in more detail at the law of nuisance and the way that the courts and the cases have responded to this conundrum over the decades and over the years, looking at where the law provides redress and protection as between those who are creating a nuisance and those who are complaining about a nuisance. But suffice to say, the fact that somebody moved to where the nuisance is will not necessarily protect the creator of the nuisance. That is not a principle. Moving close to a nuisance is no defence per se. So that requires some investigation and unpacking as well. But in our introductory section, again, it is enough to note that that is so, and that is why noise sources, music venues, pubs, nightclubs, and any other noise source, industry, whatever it might happen to be, has reason to be worried at our new models for development and urban regeneration and so forth, and their quiet locality, their relatively remote locality that never had neighbours before, now more than likely to see neighbours coming in, and they cannot guarantee that they will be protected from complaints in the future by the law as it stands at the minute. And so that is what the agent of change principle is trying to grab and capture and reflect, and to provide that balance, to provide that symbiotic relationship between these competing land uses. Now, precisely how it does that, precisely how we see that play out on a case-by-case basis or on a wider policy basis, will be the subject of future chapters. We will see whether the agent of change behaves effectively or not, and then perhaps what we could do about it in the future, and to monitor some of the developments that are coming forward with the agent of change. So that's chapter 1. Thank you very much for watching. I'm Sarah Clover. I'm at King's Chambers, and this is the Agent of Change podcast.